In his 90 years, Churchill had spent 55 years as a member of parliament, 31 years as a minister, and nearly 9 years as a prime minister. He had been present at or fought in 15 battles and had been awarded 14 campaign medals, some with multiple clasps. He had been a prominent figure in the First World War and a dominant one in the Second. He had published nearly 10 million words, more than most professional writers in their lifetime, and painted over 500 canvases, more than most professional painters. He had reconstructed a stately home and created a splendid garden with its 3 lakes, which he had caused to be dug himself. He had built a cottage and a garden wall. He was a Fellow of the Royal Society, an Elder Brother of Trinity House, a Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, a Royal Academician, a University Chancellor, a Nobel Prizeman, a Knight of the Garter, a Companion of Honor, and a member of the Order of Merit. Scores of towns made him an honorary citizen, dozens of universities awarded him honorary degrees, and 13 countries gave him medals. He hunted big game and won a score of races. How many bottles of champagne he consumed is not recorded, but it may be close to 20,000. He had a large and much-loved family and countless friends. So Winston Churchill led a full life, and few people are ever likely to equal it, its amplitude, variety, and success on so many fronts. But all can learn from it. As you can now guess or know, this episode is on Winston Churchill, the famed Prime Minister of Britain during World War II. This is by Paul Johnson. It's called Churchill by Paul Johnson, author of A History of the American People. Oh, actually, no, that's not. That's a different book. This is called Churchill by Paul Johnson. Paul Johnson's a great writer. These are very concise, 170-page biographies, which is awesome. Churchill is an absolute legend, as you can tell by that introduction. I mean, the life that this guy lived, similar to Teddy Roosevelt in a kind of funny way, because they actually crossed paths and the interaction is funny, which we'll get into. But similar to Teddy Roosevelt, it's like he lived 10 lives in one life. He was forever at it, as Teddy Roosevelt was. And so what we're going to do is we're going to learn from him. We're going to learn about his leadership. We're going to learn about his tenacity, his absolute indomitable will, how he went to rock bottom 3 times in his life where he had his fame, money, and power all stripped of him. He got back up, ended up being the most powerful person in Britain and likely saving Britain from utter ruin during World War II. He painted, he wrote, he built, he made money, he spoke. I mean, he's just a prolific guy in the truest sense of the word. So with that said, let's dive into it. Let's learn from Winston Churchill. The first note, which is, if you've listened to any of the other book review episodes, this is becoming a common denominator already. He had a strong sense of self-belief from an early age. His belief was, in many ways, unwavering. People took note of it. There's actually a little story. This is pretty funny. As a young politician, he found himself sitting at dinner next to Violet Asquith, daughter of the then Chancellor of the Exchequer at Cheshire. I don't know what that is, but it's a high government office in Britain. Responding to her question, he announced, "We are all worms, but I really think I am a glowworm." That's a funny little anecdote, but he just always believed in himself to a very, very high degree, which leads to his parents, because obviously parents have a large role in creating or influencing self-belief and self-esteem in children. His father was very harsh, very, very harsh on him. His father was a lord. He kind of had some ups and downs in his career, ended up failing pretty dramatically. A lot of people knew him because of a particular falling out or failing that he had. So he was a aristocrat, but he wasn't like this hugely successful guy, but he was very harsh on Winston. His mother was half American, which I find to be interesting because there's something to the American spirit. There's something to what American beliefs and values do to a person and how they can change their temperament and their disposition. For example, to the book, she was also very much an American. She believed the sky was the limit, that everything was possible. The tradition, precedents, the right way of doing things could always be ignored when ambition demanded. She loved high risks and did not weep, for long anyway, if they did not come off. So she taught him to full send. She was like, you have to take risks. That's the American in her. That's the American in Winston Churchill. You have to take risks. You have to be able to willing to burn the ships, to sleep on the floor, to do whatever it takes. You can throw, quote, tradition, which is interesting because Britain is obviously the United Kingdom is a very traditioned culture. And that would actually cause, later in his life, Winston Churchill to, rub some people the wrong way because he was sort of, he marched to his own beat. So that's the American in him. I felt that was interesting to note. His father was very harsh, sort of a failed British aristocrat. His mother was very loving and half American, which definitely was important for him. Another thing that I think is interesting, just because this is in the beginning of the book, it's not really, we'll talk about it later, but to the book, 5 of the first 7 dukes were victims of pathological depression. Winston, it is true, complained of periodic dark moods, which he called the black dog, but these were occasioned by actual reverses and were soon dispersed by vigorous activity. The note there is depression, and this is something that I've spoke on many, many times. I actually wrote a tweet about it I'm going to read real quick. Churchill was depressed, Roosevelt was depressed, Lincoln was depressed, Rockefeller was depressed, Napoleon was depressed. It's a shared trait of many men who dare greatly to have seasons of doubt, worry, and fear, sometimes to the point of temporary debilitation. What makes them great, however, is not that they experienced depressed states, but that they moved forward resolutely. The devil threatens most strongly those who most strongly threaten him. You're not messed up if you're feeling down. You're not weak if your energy is low. It's all a part of the experience of life. You just have to keep moving forward. And it gives me solace because if you're listening to this, I'm assuming that you've had darker periods in your life. You've had periods where you were less certain, more anxious, more down. Your energy wasn't as high. You didn't know what was going on you didn't know what direction you were going. If you have experienced that, or even if you're in that season right now, you have to understand that I dare say the majority of great men or men who have accomplished great things and influenced people in a very positive way have gone through the exact same seasons of life, and some to a higher or more deep degree than you could possibly imagine. Churchill being one of them. He had some pretty dang low lows, and he just would not stop moving forward, and that's a characteristic of most of the men that I've studied thus far, and I'm assuming that it will remain a common trait as I continue my studies. It's something that I've taken to heart. It's given me solace in moments of lower energy or uncertainty, and I hope it does the same for you because it's a powerful notion to remember that all of these great men experienced similar thing to what you've experienced if you can relate. Another note is that he was pretty much anti-school. He wasn't a very good student. He, quick quote from the book, he was not a boy who did naturally well at school and his reports were mediocre. The note there is that school is not for everyone. It's not, especially in the modern sense, is not the best determinant for capability. In my opinion, the public school system these days and the college education system, especially in America, most of the West, is meant to make you an employee. It's for a specific temperament to thrive in. I myself did not like school unless it was a class that I was very interested in. Winston Churchill was similar in that way. If he was interested in it, he would read voraciously. He would study on his own, but he just hated school. He didn't like having to sit down and being told what to do and ask when to go to the bathroom. I relate to that. Maybe you do as well. It's just interesting because some people that I've studied are very good at school. They excelled in academics. Winston Churchill did not. So I think it's interesting to take note of that. The note is certainly that school is not for everyone, and it's not the best indicator of future success, in my opinion. Another thing to note is that I'm going to say this probably 1,000,000 times in my life. If you are not reading, as a young man particularly, or a man of any age, but if you're 25 years old and you're not reading, if you want to become a great man or accomplish great things, you are failing yourself. Because without exception, the great men that I've studied thus far were voracious readers and writers. They read nonstop. I said this on Twitter the other day too, but Napoleon traveled with the library. Alexander the Great slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. Teddy Roosevelt would sometimes read multiple books in a single day. Winston Churchill, as I'm about to read, would read when his friends were playing or sleeping. The list goes on and on and on and on. Warren Buffett, he reads all the time. I digress. You need to be reading. These people have produced playbooks They've written playbooks for you and I to study, to learn from, and then implement into our own lives so that we can do similar things that they've done or accomplish similar things or bigger and better things. But the note here, and this is a common thread throughout Winston's life and many of the men that we'll study, they read voraciously from a young age and they wrote a lot. They read and then they wrote in an effort, maybe not consciously, but in an effort to consolidate, delineate, and clarify their thoughts about what they were learning, what they were doing, etc. So, to the book real quick. Winston became not merely adept, but masterly in his use of words, and he loved them. They became the verbal current coursing through his veins as he shaped his political manhood. No English statesman has ever loved them more or made more persistent use of them to forward his career and redeem it in time of trouble. Words were also his main source of income throughout his life from the age of 21. So you have to read, you have to write. It's in my opinion, it's a non-negotiable. If you want to become a great man, you need to study other great men. You need to study the field of interest that you're in, your field of work or occupation. You have to read, you have to study, you have to acquire knowledge so that you can then change your behavior and have better outcomes. The other thing to mention is that he was not a naturally gifted speaker. He stuttered. He was not a particularly eloquent speaker naturally. He had to really work at it, which is another interesting thing. Many people think that, I'm not a good public speaker. I get nervous, blah, blah, blah. Irrelevant, non-factor excuse. He worked at it. He became one of the most prolific and eloquent and moving speakers of his time, if not ever. And he was not gifted that gift at birth. He had to work for it. So I mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, who is a historical mentor to me in many ways. I admire and respect the man that Teddy Roosevelt was immensely. They had a little run-in, which I think is funny, and it's worth mentioning. The two men had a great deal in common, referring to Teddy Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, but did not get on. Roosevelt said, "That young man Churchill is not a gentleman. He did not rise to his feet when a lady enters the room." So it's just interesting how that TR, in his American aristocratic way, thought that Churchill was not a gentleman because he didn't stand up when a woman walked into the room. I find that to be pretty funny. Like I said, to the book, he read everything of value he could get his hands on and forgot nothing he read. Most spent, referring to his peers when he was young, most spent it in siesta, meaning sleeping. Churchill read. I will say this, I'm telling you a million times, even in this podcast, you need to read. You and I need to read. We have to read. We have to study. We have to read. Put the phone down. Put the Netflix down. Find a character that you're interested in and read, and then make a habit of it and read and read and read and study and study and study. It's the number one lesson that I've learned so far from studying these people is that they all read and they all wrote, pretty much, almost to a T. Something to note about Churchill is that perhaps it was his mother, the American in her, perhaps it was his father's failings, but he sought fame and power from a young age. He kind of had this roadmap of he wanted to go to war, he wanted to get famous, and then he wanted to get power from that fame. And that's honestly kind of how his life worked out. People don't really know this. A lot of people don't, at least. I was never taught this, that he was actually a very valiant soldier, and he ended up becoming a prisoner of war. But to the book, he wrote to his mother, which tersely and crudely exposed his aim to use fame and war to get himself into Parliament. Quote to his mother, "A few months in South Africa would earn me the SA medal, and in all probability the company's star. Thence, hot to foot to Egypt, to return with 2 more decorations in a year or 2, and beat my sword into an iron dispatch box." Meaning, I'm going to use my fame or my notoriety or my military experience in war, my glory in war, to parlay that into fame upon returning, parlay that fame into power and political positioning. One thing about Churchill, he was abrasive. He rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and that's a common thread throughout his life. He just did his own thing. He rubbed people the wrong way, which caused him great turmoil in certain times. But when it needed to be done, when he was the person that needed to be the leader of the country, it actually was instrumental in his success and the success of the nation. Honestly, probably the success of the Allies in World War II as well. To the book, Churchill's growing reputation as a pushy metal chaser chaser. He was referred to as a leader in his military unit or regiment, that he perceived him as a pushy metal chaser, and he did not want him. So that reminds me of a quote that I heard about Winston Churchill from his first love, the first girl he ever loved, Pamela Plowden. The first time you meet him, you see all of his faults. However, the rest of your life you spend in discovering his virtues. That's a powerful notion, in my opinion. He was abrasive. He was obnoxious in some ways, obtrusive in some ways. But when you got to know him, you realized his virtues. You understood his virtues. You understood why he did what he did, and the you could say altruistic undertones of his actions, and turned people off the wrong, like, immediately. But as most people got to know him, they began to admire him, respect him, and sort of grow fond of his idiosyncrasies and his uniqueness. It became like a sort of a national, not joke, but like, especially when he became prime minister, people were like, they loved him for the most part, and they sort of it was like a national trend to sort of adopt some of his uniqueness and idiosyncrasies and things like that, or at least be fond of them. I mentioned he was a prisoner of war. Pretty insane story to the book, and then I'll explain it. Next came South Africa, where he reported the Boer War. So he went to war. It's an interesting cycle. He went to war oftentimes reporting, because he's a great writer, so he would report while he was at war for publications back in UK and London and things of that sort, and he'd make money. So he was going to war, gaining fame and glory and notoriety, and also making money. He's smart in that way. He used his power and skill with words to his benefit, for sure, throughout his life. To the book. Next came South Africa, where he reported the Boer War for the Morning Post. Strictly speaking, he was a non-combatant, but during a Boer ambush of an armored train, he took an active part, characteristically directing operations to free the engine. He was captured, made a prisoner of war, escaped, had a hazardous journey through the Boer lines with posters advertising a large reward for his recapture, and had a rapturous welcome in Durban, where he found himself a hero. He then went back to the war in earnest, showing an extraordinary amount of physical energy. That's a little bit of it's a short summary. Paul Johnson does that a lot. He kind of just goes over the wave tops, which I actually really like. He doesn't get too deep into the details of anything. But at some other time, I'll do another book on Winston Churchill, and we'll go more into depth than that. But the story is incredible. You can look it up if you want. Look up Churchill's escape as a POW. He was like hiding in the back of trucks. They had a huge reward for him. He risked his life to a high degree. He took immense amount of risk escaping, exercised, and showed an immense amount of courage. And as it said, he showed an extraordinary amount of physical energy. That's another common thread throughout a lot of these guys, is their energy was just unmatched. They just were obsessed with what they were doing, and the energy that they put forth in their aim, or to fulfill their aim, or to reach their aim, was extraordinary. Energy wins. Energy wins. Energy wins. It's persuasive. It's compelling. It's a powerful force. The person with the most energy oftentimes can lead people in the direction that they're going. In his youth, he was hyperactive as another idea. He might have had ADHD. I think that's interesting, because I was diagnosed with ADHD. Maybe you were as well. It's his youth, hyperactive, energetic, bad at school, loved studying things that he was interested in, loved writing, relentlessly physically active. It's a very interesting combination of traits for a young man, and it obviously paid off in a great way. So he goes back to the war. He gets into Parliament as a young man. His plan starts to take shape, which I find to be pretty interesting, because he was like 26, I think, when he got into Parliament, which is extraordinarily young. I mean, I'm 25. Maybe you're around the same age. Can you imagine being in Parliament of the largest empire in the world? It's kind of funny. One thing, so he came back, he wrote a book, and he had this sort of pervading idea throughout his entire life. A direct quote from him: "I do not think the book will bring me many friends, but in writing, the great thing is to be honest." He was not afraid. This is another thing, I've said it already. He was not afraid to be abrasive. He was not afraid to be disliked. He was not afraid to be, counted out. He knew that this book that he was publishing was going to not make him many friends, but he said, "I'm going to be honest." And truth wins in the end. That's so important to me. for you and I, really, the truth wins in the end. Nobody has ever gotten away with a lie, ever. Nobody's ever gotten away with misleading or deceit, ever. It will come back to haunt you. He was not afraid to tell the truth, and as Jordan Peterson says, basically tell the truth and have fun riding or living the adventure that comes with it. There's no greater adventure than telling the truth, and Winston Churchill believed that for certain. One of the things about him in his political career, he had phenomenal foresight, especially militarily. He basically called World War I, and he pretty much called World War II too. And people, it was not a common thing. Like he went against the grain in that way. To the book, a European war cannot be anything but a cruel, heart-rending struggle, which, if we are not to enjoy the bitter fruits of victory, must demand, perhaps for several years, the whole manhood of the nation, the entire suspension of peaceful industries, and the concentration to one end of every vital energy in the community. The wars of people will be more terrible than the wars of kings. These prophetic words were spoken more than a dozen years before the catastrophe occurred in 1914. So almost 15 years before World War I happened, he was starting to understand the European political scene, what was happening with different countries, different tensions, different leaderships, and all these things. And he basically called it. And people were like, dude, you're crazy. That's not going to happen. All that stuff. He was a firm believer that war was going to come and that you needed to be prepared for it. And another thing that he noted, and I'll go to the book here for a sec. Churchill was never a warmonger as his enemies claimed. On the contrary, he warned against it just as urgently as he warned against unpreparedness for it. The two were indivisible, but Churchill was sufficient of a realist to grasp that wars will come and that a victorious one, however dreadful, is preferable to a lost one. Instrumental to his leadership throughout his career. Wars will come. There's no two ways about it. You can be a pacifist if you want. Does not matter. Wars will come. That's how human nature is. If wars will come, we must prepare for them, because if a war is going to come, inevitably, it's much better to win a war than to lose the war. If it's going to come regardless, it is much better to win. And that was a core principle of his political career. That the lesson in there for us is to just be prepared and to read. He understood these things because he read voraciously. He read all the time. So he understood the landscape, the political landscape, the military landscape. He understood history. He understood all these things because he read, and he then used that knowledge to prepare for the upcoming things, and that's a huge lesson for you and I. Preparation and reading. He was not a party man. To the book, he was not a party man. That was the truth. His loyalty belonged to the natural interest and his own. Something to take note there is that George Washington, founding father of the United States, first president, obviously, had a quote that this reminded me of. Quote, however, political parties may now and then answer popular ends. They are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. A simpler way of saying that is political parties will ultimately be the death of the nation, because people will associate with the success of the party more than the nation. In the politically turbulent times that we have now, I think it's also an important lesson. Where do our actual loyalties lie? Do they lie with our political inclination in terms of party, or are they actually our nation's interest and our community's interest? Do we actually care about what political party wins, or do we care about the nation winning in the long run? And Churchill was adamantly in favor of the national interest as opposed to parties, because he switched parties several times throughout his career. Another note about him is he never really took himself too seriously. He had this sort of, not aloofness, but he was always jovial most of the time. He was characteristically jovial, laughing, funny. He was kind. He didn't harbor much hatred, even though people hated him. He didn't take himself too seriously. He lived with a sort of he lived with an understanding that life's not forever, it's not going to last, and I might as well enjoy this time. His wife was instrumental. I think her name was Clementine, or I think he called her Clemmy. But to the book, this is about Mr. and Mrs. Churchill's relationship. Among all the 20th century ruling elites, the Churchills must be judged to have the most successful marriage. It can be said with reasonable certitude that each was totally faithful to the other. She devoted herself completely to her remarkable husband, gave him much good, usually liberal advice, which was not always taken, comforted him in his many career mishaps, and calmed him down when he was triumphant. Quote, he always insists I am by him, she said, and then promptly forgets my existence. Kind of funny, because she says he always insists that I'm by him and then promptly forgets that I'm there. It was like this comfort to him. It was like that quote where it's like behind every great man is a good man is a great woman. Truest application of that is their relationship. She was the rock to him in many, many ways. Perhaps another lesson for you and I. He was also a romantic in a way. He similar to TR, he was, to the book, he was impelled by a genuine passion for the least fortunate members of society, by a strong belief that society could be made both humane and more efficient, and by his feeling that revolution, of which there were rumblings all over the world at this time, could only be averted by judicious reforms. He was a romantic in that he did believe in an ideal. He believed in the idea that society could reach this sort of, not utopia, but society could be made more humane for everybody, for the underdogs as well as the wealthy aristocratic class. An interesting thing about his monetary habits is throughout his life, he basically believed that income should be increased as expenses increased. So he would go through these sort of ebbs and flows of making a lot of money, spending a lot of money, then making a lot of money, then spending a lot of money, and making a lot of money, and spending a lot of money, until ultimately at the end of his life, he was pretty wealthy because of several of the books that he wrote being phenomenally successful. But I don't know if that's good or bad advice, but he lived a pretty dang good life. But he basically believed that income should be increased as expenses increased, which maybe not the best or most sound financial advice, but it seemed to have worked for him. I mentioned that he was hyperactive and that he was always moving. There's this quote in this book that he, quote, always had to see for himself. He refused to be bound to a desk. He always had to see for himself. He wanted to go to the front lines when he was a leader. Like, despite being advised not to by many people, he literally did go to the front lines at a pretty pivotal point in his political career. He wanted, when he was the leader of different ministries of the United Kingdom government, he would go see for himself. He'd go to the front lines. He'd go to the factories. He'd go to all these places to see for himself, which I think is a powerful lesson as well. But I mentioned he reached rock bottom 3 times. He's a young man. He's got this fame. He's got this glory. He's got starting to get some money. World War I happens, even though he called it. The Dardanelles he basically got blamed for the Dardanelles, which is a military disaster or rout. I'm not sure of the specifics of it, but he got blamed for a really big failure in the military or in the government, and that basically put him out of favor, out of power, and he lost a good bit of money as well. So that's rock bottom number 1. It said it was the lowest point in Churchill's life. To the book. In fact, when he painted it, I'd pretty well lost everything. He brooded in his inactivity. That he's talking about somebody painted like a bust of him or whatever you call it, like a portrait. In fact, when he had painted it, I'd pretty well lost everything. He brooded. Everything. He brooded in his inactivity, something he had never experienced before. His wife later told Martin Gilbert, his great biographer, I thought he would die of grief. And that reminds me of that Teddy Roosevelt quote that I've said many times, that black care rarely sits behind the rider whose pace is fast enough. Idle hands are the devil's playground. Churchill was a believer in that, and he experienced it firsthand. When there was nothing for a man to do but attack himself, it's a pretty dark place to be, and he had that several times in his life. But the important thing to note is that he moved resolutely forward no matter what. Just like Napoleon, just like Rockefeller, just like TR, just like all the guys that I already mentioned. They had these seasons, but they just kept on moving forward. They did not let that define them or quell their energy or their fervor for life. So he loses favor. He begins painting and things of that sort. Leisure was one of his greatest strengths because it's what allowed him. He would exert these phenomenal bursts of energy for extended period of times, years sometimes. Then he would hit rock bottom. Then he'd have these periods of leisure of building his garden, building his home, painting. He became a prolific painter, prolific writer, where he would sort of rebuild himself. Naval Ravikant talks about the lion, like living like a lion, which is where you hunt, you feast, and then you rest. You hunt and you feast, then you rest. It's not this sort of rat-like existence of perpetual, consistent energy expenditure. It's an acute burst of energy, like 100%, bam, 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 balls to the wall, and then rest. Churchill used painting, leisure, reading, writing, and working in his garden as that leisurely activity that refueled him, that revamped him and gave him more energy. When he got back to, he basically rock bottom, then he got to power again, or then he got energized, then he got to power again, and he went back to the front lines in Flanders, I believe, where he sort of regained his energy and his zest and his zeal for life. He was a prolific smoker of cigars and alcohol. He drank a lot of alcohol and he smoked a lot of cigars. In the start of the podcast, I mentioned that he might have drinking, the author estimates about 20,000 bottles of champagne in his life. That's insane. Pretty much every meal, he either had champagne or watered down whiskey, and he smoked a handful to a dozen of cigars every day, which is kind of funny, is what it is. But to the leisure point, here's a couple notes from the book. The real personality of Chartwell, which was his sort of country mansion in Britain, however, lies in the surrounding grounds and buildings, which were entirely of his design and often literally of his creation. As the plaque there states, he built most of the cottage and a large proportion of the kitchen garden wall, having learned to lay bricks in a rough and ready manner. So he used this sort of hands-on work to free his mind, to take his focus off of the turmoil that was going on in his life. The several times that he reached rock bottom, he used those things as an escape, almost as a way to rest and rejuvenate himself. The reason I think that's important is because in today's world with like monk mode and all this stuff, there's all this, I don't know, it's like the rat race cycle of just like working like a slave for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours every day. Never take any days off. You can't take any days off. If you really care, if you're really obsessed, you don't take any days off. I believe that to be complete and utter nonsense, because I'm reading about Jeff Bezos right now. I'll do an episode on Amazon here soon. He took entire days off in the middle of the week when they were first building Amazon. Like in the book, they were like, not a lot of urgency was going on. They would literally come to office on Tuesday and be like, hey, let's go hike. And they would just go hike. So I think it's a complete fallacy and a psyop that you can't have leisure, that you have to grind 24/7, 365. I think that's complete horseshit. I think that there is seasons and cyclicality, and embracing those seasons and cyclicality is the important thing. Understanding when is the time to push forward, when is the time to rest. That is the great question or equation to try to figure out in life, in my opinion, for you and I. When do I rest? How do I put every bit of energy, focus, and attention as I possibly can into this thing? Then succeed at that thing or fulfill that thing or move on from that thing, and then rest, and then do the same thing. But it's not this constant, perpetual, like steady state expenditure of energy. I reject that, and I think many of the greatest men in the world or of history have also rejected that and lived completely counter to that. Here's an interesting thing. This is about World War II. This is perhaps a meta question, but it's interesting because we hear about history. We hear about, obviously, Nazi Germany and then Russia and how they were communists, but we allied with them. Churchill, quote, "Of all the tyrannies in history, the Bolshevik tyranny is the worst. The Russian regime was, quote, an animal form of barbarism, maintained by, quote, bloody and wholesale butcheries and murders carried out by Chinese-style executions in armored cars." That's Churchill talking about the Bolsheviks who were in power in Russia, yet we allied with them. I find that to be interesting. It's a geopolitical question. Obviously, we weren't there, but if he believed that of all the tyrannies in history, the Bolsheviks were the worst, I find it to be interesting, or at least the circumstances that led to us allying with them are pretty insane, because that's a crazy thing to say about somebody that you ally with, that they are the worst tyranny in history. So something to think about. I say this often, but like history is written by the victor. I believe that wholeheartedly. It's the stories that the victor choose to tell, not the whole truth. And that was just an interesting question, because I didn't know Churchill thought Russians were the worst tyranny in history, and then we partnered with him. But nonetheless, so before World War II starts, he kind of gets blamed again for, I read about Alistair Urquhart, the Forgotten Highlander, a prisoner of war in Singapore, in the British Army in Singapore, held captive by the Japanese for most of World War II. It was one of the greatest military disasters in British history, if not maybe the most. They were completely inadequately underprepared. They basically took for granted the Japanese military, and Japan basically stormed in and took thousands and thousands and thousands of troops and a prominent fort and important geographical location, like it was like taking candy from a baby. It was extremely easy for them. And Churchill was largely at fault. One thing about it, though, is he never shrank, to the book, he never shrank from accepting responsibility when it was just. He he didn't shy away from that. He was responsible, and he learned from it. To the book. He seemed to Lord Winterton, MP, hitherto a sharp critic, so somebody who was a critic of him, a man transformed, head and shoulders above anyone else in the House, not excluding Lloyd George. He had suddenly acquired, quite late in parliamentary life, an immense fund of tact, patience, good humor, and banter on almost all occasions. No one used to suffer fools ungladly more than Winston. Now he is friendly and accessible to everyone, both in the House and in the lobbies, with the result that he has become what he never was before the war, very popular in the House generally. The idea there to me is that he learned and he adapted. His young life, as we now know, he was abrasive, he was very obtrusive, rubbed people the wrong way, but as he got older, he learned that that's not how he's going to get what he wants to get or become or get to the powerful positions he wanted to get to. So he adapted. He realized, you know what, maybe I should be more cordial. Maybe I should be more or less offensive. Maybe I should be more approachable. And he did those things, and it ended up ultimately in him becoming the prime minister. You have to be adapting. You have to be learning. You have to be growing. It also reminds me of a quote about him, or that he wrote, about being prepared for your destiny. To each, there comes in their lifetime a special moment when they are figuratively tapped on the shoulder and offered the chance to do a very special thing, unique to them and fitted to their talents. What a tragedy if that moment finds them unprepared or unqualified for that which could have been their finest hour. He got tapped on the shoulder and he was ready. He was prepared for his destiny because of the work that he had done and the studies that he had done early in his life. He ends up losing a crap ton of money and he gets hit by a car. It's just tough go of it for the guy. He had a really tough stretch. I'll read the book. So he loses a ton of money and then he gets hit by a car. He was very down. He told Clemmy, his wife, I have now in the last 2 years had 3 very heavy blows. First, the loss of all that money in the crash, then the loss of my political position in the Conservative Party, and now this terrible physical injury. He was afraid he would never recover from these blows. The thing that this reminds me of, a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, after his wife died and his mom died in the same day, the only thing to do is move resolutely forward. That's the only option in a time like that. You just have to move resolutely forward. It's the only thing that Winston Churchill knew how to do, and he did it. I certainly suffered every pang, mental and physical, that a street accident or, I suppose, a shell wound can produce. None is unendurable. There is neither the time nor the strength for self-pity. There is no room for remorse or for fears. You've been knocked down. You've been dragged. You've lost money, I'm sure. You've probably gotten your heart broken. All these things. We're still young men at large, so many more, quote, unfortunate events to happen in our life with certainty. There's no time for self-pity. You and I cannot wallow in our fears. We cannot wallow in our doubts. We cannot wallow in our self-pity and our angst or curse God for having this thing happen to us. The only thing to do is to endure and to move resolutely forward. From that time in his life, rock bottom again, he had this quote that I think is absolutely phenomenal. For the rest, live dangerously. Take things as they come. Fear not, all will be well. Fear not, all will be well. Live dangerously. What more is there to do? Live dangerously. Take things as they come. Fear not, all will be well. That reminds me of a Maria Rayner Rilke quote or a poem. It goes something like, let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Everything will pass. All will be well. You just have to live dangerously and keep frickin' moving forward. You have to keep moving forward. You cannot sit there and wallow in your own fears or your doubts or your depression or your angst. You just have to pick a direction and start taking steps in that direction. And that's what he did. And that's why he ended up being one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. You and I can learn from that. You and I can directly apply that to our own lives. Okay, so World War II is about to happen. Stuff's shaking out to be pretty tense and contended. A lot of contention in Europe at this time. People, especially in the British government, people are very passive. People are like, oh, this is literally why Churchill ended up becoming prime minister, because Chamberlain was very pacifist. He was trying to make a deal with the Nazis, and they ended up realizing, oh wait, this is way too past due. We can't do that. We have to fight. People knew exactly who to turn to. It was Churchill. He called this way before. And this is also why they turned to him, because he had been saying this stuff for years. And people were like, oh, wait, he literally just called this almost to a T. We should probably listen to this guy now. To the book. He did not see himself as a reactionary longing for a past that was gone, but as the prophet of a dangerous future. The world, he said, was entering a period when the struggle for self-preservation is going to present itself with great intenseness to thickly populated industrial countries. Britain would soon be, quote, fighting for its life. He said the quiet part out loud before anybody else did, just like he did earlier in the book, or earlier in his life. He told the truth and accepted the consequences and the adventure of that. People thought he was crazy. People thought he was like he was a militaristic, warmongering guy, but he was just telling the truth. He understood what he understood because he learned, he studied, he listened, and he watched. He said what he thought was going to happen, like he truthfully thought was going to happen, and he bore the consequences. He bore the adventure of speaking the truth. You and I can learn from that as well. Tell the truth all the time, no matter what, and live the adventure that is a consequence of it. It's the greatest adventure that we can live. And Winston Churchill literally lived that way, and it ended up benefiting him and millions and millions and millions and millions of people in the aftermath as a result. Here's an interesting description of Churchill later in life. When Winston was born, lots of fairies swooped down on his cradle with gifts, imagination, eloquence, industry, ability. And then came a fairy who said, no one person has right to so many gifts, picked him up and gave him such a shake and twist that with all these gifts, he was denied judgment and wisdom. And that is why, while we delight to listen to him in the house, we would not take his advice. Interesting, kind of funny. That was a fellow House of Commons member basically saying he's got all these amazing gifts, but wisdom and judgment is not one of them. Once again, they said that before he turned out to be right about everything. So who's laughing now? You know, Winston. So he gets the call, essentially. Chamberlain resigned or retired, I believe, as a prime minister, and people wanted Churchill. So he gets the call, he becomes prime minister, and he writes this little excerpt. I was conscious of a profound sense of relief. At last, I had authority to give directions over the whole scene. I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. 10 years in the political wilderness had freed me from ordinary party antagonisms. My warnings over the past 6 years had been so numerous, so detailed, and were now so terribly vindicated that no one could gainsay me. I could not be reproached either for making the war or with want of preparation for it. I thought I knew a good deal about it all, and I was sure I would not fail. Therefore, although impatient for the morning, I slept soundly and had no need for cheering dreams. Facts are better than dreams. Talk about self-belief. He said, I thought I knew a good deal about it all, and I was sure I would not fail. He also, as I mentioned, was so terribly accurate and detailed in his description of what would happen that when they actually happened, when his foresights were vindicated, people had no choice but to believe, oh, wait, this guy actually knows what he's talking about. And then he becomes a prime minister and literally saves Britain from destruction. I already mentioned this, but the idea that a war will come and a war that is lost is much worse than a war that is won. To the book, a quote from him: victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory however long and hard the road may be, for without victory, there is no survival. The lesson here for you and I believe, is that if we are going to pursue something, if we're going to create a, quote, war for ourselves or a competition, whether it's business, martial arts, an athletic career, if you're going to actually play the game, why the hell are you playing if you're not playing to win? If you're not playing to taste the fruits of victory, then why the hell are you in the arena? You actually have to ask yourself. I think we all should ask ourselves, why are we playing the games we're playing? If we don't want to win the games that we're playing, why the absolute hell are you playing them? If you don't want to win them, don't play them. And then find a game that you want to win and can play that game until you win at all costs. As Churchill said, he basically said, we're in a war, and the only thing left to do now is to become victorious, because if we don't become victorious, we will not survive. Obviously, we're not in an actual war, like a military conflict, but we can apply this to our own lives for certain. You're in the job that you're in. Why do you want to win that game? Why are you in that game? If you don't, if you do, then freaking win it. The podcast. Do I want to win this? If not, then don't do the podcast. If I want to win it, then I need to actually do the things and make the effort and time and energy to actually win this game. Same thing with jiu-jitsu, same thing with boxing, same thing with athletics, same thing with being in the gym. Matthew McConaughey talks about it, but like if you're going to do something, don't half-ass it. Like it's either do it or don't do it. It's either do it to the full capabilities and capacity that I have available, or don't do it at all. Winston Churchill believed in that wholeheartedly, and without that, I would venture to say that Britain would probably not be what it is today. So, lesson for you and I. Another lesson. When there is so much chaos, this is from his time as a leader in World War II. When there is chaos amongst us, when there is many things happening, when there are many directions, many orders, many moving parts, he said, it is sloth to not condense your words. You have to be concise with your orders. You have to be concise with your directions. You have to be concise with your writing, your words, all these things. He even asked, please inform me on one sheet of paper why. So like he would have these incredibly detailed and concise orders, and he asked his subordinates and people reporting to him to tell me what's going on in half a sheet of paper. Bam. I want to know exactly what's going on to the clearest possible minutia within a half page. I think that's a good lesson for you and I. I understand that's a skill that needs to be acquired, and the only way we acquire that skill is through speaking and through writing. Start recording videos of yourself speaking, and then do like football film where you like watch it and you're like, okay, well, I could take that word out. Before you send an email, say, hey, you know what sentences are not pertinent? How could I condense this to save? It's also respect. It's a respect thing for somebody else's time. If I don't need to say something to you to get the point across, then why would I say it? Because that takes up your time and my time. Not a good idea. Not the most efficient. Not the most effective. It is sloth to not condense your words. Something we should all learn from in our communications, especially in chaotic times. During the war, Churchill's speaking. I think he's speaking at his old school to a bunch of boys at his old school. He says, do not let us speak of darker days. Let us rather speak of sterner days. These are not dark days. These are great days, the greatest days our country has ever lived. And we must all thank God that we have been allowed, each of us according to our stations, to play a part in making these days memorable in the history of our race. Two verses come to mind there. Romans 5:3, which is something to the effect of, not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings. For we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character. Character produces hope. And we shall not be put to shame by hope. The second verse is Esther 4:14, which says something to the effect of, perhaps you were brought to the kingdom for such a time as this. The lessons there for me, do not speak of the times that we're in as darker days. It's so easy to doom, gloom, and fear-monger all the time and get lost in the doom scrolling of, oh, wow, the world is screwed. There's so much evil. There's so much wrong, blah, blah, blah. They're not the darker days. They're the sterner days. They're the great days, because these are the days that we've been called to the kingdom to be a part of. This is the play that we've been called to act in, to play in, to play our part and our role in. They're not dark days. They're amazing days. They're awesome days. They're great days, because they're the days that we're given. And if we rejoice in the fact that they're hard, that there will be suffering, we will get perseverance. And if we get perseverance, we'll get character. And if we get character, we'll have hope. And we will not be put to shame by hope. We will be exalted in our hope. Huge lesson. He was a master of words once again. He was a master of gifting people his energy and his mental fortitude. He was able to like impart it on people in such a profound way, and that's why the nation rallied behind him so fervently when he was the leader of Britain in World War II. Something to note, I already mentioned leisure. You can imagine in a time as World War II, probably one of the most chaotic times in global history, he's the leader of somebody right in the thick of it, of a nation right in the thick of it. Paul Johnson in the book says, Churchill's great strength was his power of relaxation. If you're constantly giving 5 out of 10 energy, you will never be able to give 10 out of 10 energy. What's better, giving 5 out of 10 energy 100% of the time, or 10 out of 10 energy 80% of the time, and then resting? He was able to relax and rest. He was able to turn his mind off, whether it be through painting, gardening, sleeping, writing, reading, all these different things, so that he could then refuel himself and then expend 100% of his energy. I'm telling you, I firmly believe that's a lesson for you and I. There is a time for work and there's a time for leisure. I encourage you. I think we should all be encouraged to reject the psyop that there's no time for leisure. I think that's a complete fallacy that will lead to a non-enjoyable or productive life. So World War II ends. Obviously, you know what happens in World War II. Churchill starts writing again, writes an 8 million word or maybe 2 million word book, which is an absolutely insane novel, makes like 50 million off it, becomes very wealthy, travels the world, kind of starts riding off into the sunset. And what happens here, Paul Johnson describes his life in 5 lessons. He said there's 5 things that we can learn from Winston Churchill. And I'm going to go over each of those quickly. The first lesson is always aim high. As a child, Churchill received no positive encouragement from his father and little from his mother, but he still aimed high. He had high aspirations for himself, for his nation. He was a romantic in that way. He believed there was an ideal, and he believed that he could achieve it if he put the work in to do so. Aim high. Jordan Peterson talks about this too. Pick the highest aim you can possibly find and go for it. That's the only way that we'll ever live up to our potential. That's the only way we'll give God a return on his investment, if we aim at the highest ideal that we possibly can and put all of our love, hard work, and energy and focus and attention into achieving that aim or bringing that aim to fruition. Lesson number 2, there is no substitute for hard work. Yes, he was leisurely. Yes, he lived a leisurely life at times, but he worked ridiculously hard. Ridiculously hard. His energy expenditure was off the charts. He understood that there was no substitute for burning the midnight oil, as David Ogilvy would say. He understood that you just had to put in the work. You had to spend the hours. You had to study. You had to read. You had to expend your energy in a particular direction in order for positive results to result. So there's no substitute for hard work. Lesson number 3, Churchill never allowed mistakes, disaster, personal or interest or national, accidents, illnesses, unpopularity, and criticism to get him down. Yes, he had periods of depression and of black dog, as he would say it, but he never allowed those to persist. He made the adjustments and he moved forward. They were not perpetual states of depression. He said, this is enough. I'm going to get back to it. I'm going to get back on my feet. I'm going to continue moving. And he moved resolutely forward. Third lesson is do not let mistakes, disasters, accidents, illnesses get you down. I also think that stems back to the idea that he didn't take himself too seriously. Lesson number 4, Churchill wasted an extraordinarily small amount of his time and emotional energy on the meanness of life. He didn't spread rumors. He didn't have vendettas. He didn't hold grudges. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't do any dirty tricks or manipulative things. Or, I mean, maybe he did, but it wasn't like the primary focus of his life. That freed up his energy to focus on positive outcomes and positive things that actually moved society forward in a better direction. Because, everybody knows those people that just harbor on negative things. They can only focus on negative things. He was not one of those people. He focused on positive direction, positive steps. The 5th lesson is the absence of hatred left plenty of room for joy in Churchill's life. He was a joyful person. He laughed, he joked, he made a lot of money, he lost it all. He gained power, he lost it all. He was favored, then he lost his favor. He had a sort of lightness to him, but he also had a sternness to him. He could be very direct, he could have outbreaks or outbursts, but he was a joyful person, even into his late life. I think his last words were like, I've grown bored of it all, which is kind of just like a funny thing to say. It's a good insight into what type of person he was. The absence of hatred left room for joy in his life. That's all for this book. That's all for Churchill for now. We'll get back into him at some point for sure because he was such a prolific leader. This book and his story inspires the absolute heck out of me. I think the idea of getting to rock bottom 3 separate times, bouncing back, becoming one of the most important leaders in human history, and the way that he led, the things that he did, the fullness of his life. I mean, from the beginning, you remember all these things that he did. He was a painter, he was a writer, he was a builder, he was a gardener, he was a prime minister, he was a soldier, he was a reporter, he was all these things. He lived life to the full. For you and I, if you're listening to this, I'm assuming that that's also your goal, to get the most out of this thing, man, to get every ounce out of this life that we can. And Churchill was somebody who did that. And I think we can learn a whole lot. I hope that you learned something that will impact you positively from this podcast, from this book. If you want to get the book, it literally took me like 4 days to read because it's so short. It's 170 pages. It's called Churchill by Paul Johnson. Link will be in the description. You can buy it at no cost, no additional cost to you. If you use that link, I'll get a little kickback to support the podcast. But until next time, appreciate you tuning in.